Get softer, smoother, and more even-toned skin after just one use with the new Gentle Exfoliating line from Cetaphil. Formulated with a unique triple acid blend that promotes surface skin cell renewal, these gentle chemical exfoliators remove dead skin cells and refine skin's texture while hydrating, resulting in softer, smoother, more even-looking skin. Shop the new Cetaphil Gentle Exfoliating line in the face and body aisles at your local Target store or online at Cetaphil.com.
Are you ready to try the best-tasting gummy you've ever had? Well, Organifi's latest breakthrough, Better Biome Gummies, are not only delicious, but they're your new way to support a healthy gut. Better Biome Gummies are packed with the power of Live Ox Gold Kiwi Extract, a superfruit that's clinically proven to enhance your gut health by feeding beneficial bacteria and promoting growth, especially the hard-to-reach F. prau. Unlike other prebiotics that may cause bloating and gas, Live Ox helps relieve these discomforts while ensuring vital nutrients are well absorbed. And that's not all. These gut-balancing prebiotic gummies combine the soothing qualities of apple cider vinegar with the rich nutritional profile of New Zealand gold kiwi. This means improved digestion, reduced bloating, and a restored gut lining, making every gummy a step toward balance. Transform your digestive health today. Head over to www.organifi.com/bestofyou and use code bestofyou for 20% off your entire order. That's www.organifi.com/bestofyou. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Allison, and I'm so glad you're here to discover what brings out the best of you. This podcast is all about breaking free from painful patterns, mending the past, and discovering our true selves in God. I can't wait to get started as we learn together how to become the best version of who we are with God's help. Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Best of You podcast. I am so glad you're here this week. I'm so glad to be here with you. As many of you know, if you get my weekly email or you follow me on socials, we've had a really rough couple of weeks here in Wyoming with some pretty intense wildfires. So we have really appreciated your prayers for that. And I'm also mindful of all of you, especially in the Southeast, who are still reeling from the effects of both Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. These are really devastating times, and I'm so grateful for so many of you out there shining your light so brightly, even when the world can feel so dark, scary, and overwhelming. Your courage, your hope, your prayers, your incredible acts of kindness, no matter how tiny, matter. They matter to God, they matter to the other people in your life, and they matter to the parts of your soul who need to see us fighting for the goodness and the beauty and the dignity of every human life and every part of God's creation. My prayers are with you as we continue to hold forth faith and hope and light in this world. Today, we're diving into the first of a two-part series on the topic of sexuality. This is such an important topic. It's a topic I've been wanting to bring to the podcast, but I wanted to find the right experts to talk with us about such a nuanced topic, such a tender topic, a topic that is so deeply vulnerable for so many of us. So many of us have been hurt in this area. So many of us are struggling in this area, struggling to figure out how to have healthy conversations about sexuality in our world, where there are so many toxic messages coming at us from every single angle, including some messages from within our own faith communities. Here's the thing. In order to move forward into a healthier understanding of this beautiful gift of sexuality that God has given us to enjoy, sometimes we have to first look back and untangle the knots of the toxic messages we've received. And so that's where we're going to start this series with today's episode. Today's guest is a therapist and an expert, especially on the phenomena of purity culture that so many of us grew up a part of. And she's here to help name the myths and toxic messages that so many of us internalized about sex who grew up as millennials or Gen Xers, especially within the context of church culture. Purity culture was so much more than a message about abstinence and purity. It actually shaped how we viewed ourselves, our relationships, and our sense of worth. And the problem, as you'll hear from my guest today, was that sex wasn't discussed in a way that allowed us to understand the nuances and the complexity and embrace our sexuality as a natural, integral part of how God designed us. And so many of us, as a result, have experienced fear, shame, and disconnection from our bodies in ways that don't just disappear with adulthood or even in the context of marriage. So many people are still grappling with the effects of not really being brought into the fullness of a healthy sexuality, and it can feel embarrassing or even shameful to ask questions about sex 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, even into healthy marriages. So what does it look like to reclaim a healthy, holistic view of sexuality? And how do we unlearn the shame and embrace both our faith and our sexuality in a way that's life-giving? To help us navigate these questions, I am honored to welcome Dr. Camden Morganti to the show. Dr. Morganti is a licensed clinical psychologist and coach who specializes in helping people recover from the effects of purity culture. She's passionate about guiding individuals through the process of identifying harmful beliefs around sexuality and helping them build a healthier, more integrated understanding of sex, one that aligns both with their faith and their personal growth. Dr. Morganti's personal experience as a millennial who grew up within the context of purity culture, combined with her professional expertise, makes her uniquely qualified to guide us through this topic. She's been featured in numerous publications and podcasts where she speaks on the intersection of faith, sexuality, and mental health, and her compassionate, nuanced, thoughtful approach to the conversation acknowledges both the well-meaning intentions behind purity culture and the real harm it's caused. Dr. Morganti's work is grounded in the belief that sexuality is a core part of who we are as human beings and that God created us to embrace this part of ourselves fully and without shame. Her brand new book is out this week. It's called Recovering from Purity Culture: Dismantle the Myths, Reject Shame-Based Sexuality, and Move Forward in Your Faith. It's such an incredibly rich and empowering deep dive into the nuances of how we think about sexuality. I am so thrilled to bring you my conversation today with Dr. Camden Morganti. Hi, Dr. Camden. I am so thrilled to have you here today on the podcast. We've been following each other online for a little while, and it's really fun to have this conversation with you about this new book you have coming out.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Allison. I'm thrilled to be here and to see you again and connect with you again.
You were so kind to do an Instagram Live with me around, I think it was about the best of you. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. You've been great. I think it was a DM you sent me that said it is so refreshing to see people talking about these topics who are still Christian.
Yes.
Yeah. And I see you as well, really fighting for your faith, even as you're trying to disentangle from some of the toxic messages that so many of us have gotten. So to that point, you've got this new book coming out all about purity culture. We've seen that phrase thrown around, but you're really an expert on it. You're a psychologist. You've studied this. Talk to us a little bit today as we're getting started. What is this thing, purity culture? I think we're naming something, right? And it's important to name things accurately. So we've got this name that we're seeing, purity culture. What do we mean by that? What are we actually trying to identify in that term?
Yeah, there's different ways people define it, but the way I define it in my book and in my work is that it was a largely evangelical movement that peaked in the 1990s to 2000s that attempted to persuade young people especially to avoid premarital sex, using shame and fear as tools of control and coercion. So I distinguish between the belief in waiting until marriage for sex, which I call a traditional Christian sexual ethic. I distinguish between that and purity culture. To me, those are two different things. What really separates those is that purity culture added the shame and fear and control, that it wasn't really a thoughtful choice that people could make to wait for marriage to have sex, but that it was really coerced out of them with shame. And so that's the distinguishment I make. And that's one that not many other books on purity culture make that same distinction.
I really appreciated that about your book. There's a lot of nuance in it. So we're talking about a movement, and it's less about what was taught Although some folks might completely disagree with everything that they were taught. But I kind of heard you saying in your book, a lot of it is about how it was taught, how we were taught using coercion and fear. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was really the myths, the false promises, and the messages that were used to try to persuade young people that what I would call purity culture that has caused so much harm. Because again, it's different from just holding that belief and holding that value for yourself. And really, that's a deeply held value that you have. It's about offering these false promises of what you'll get if you stay abstinent before marriage. It's about what I call the myths of purity culture that didn't come from the Bible, but yet were taught to us as if they were biblical truth. And so I say it peaked in the 1990s to 2000s because that's really when millennials like myself were going through high school sex ed and youth group at church and reading these books that were geared towards especially teen girls and purity and modesty and things like that. The True Love Waits movement. And that's also why it's just a culture and not just a belief, because a culture involves purity rings, making a True Love Waits pledge. Some people went to rallies. Some people had purity balls. It's like this whole culture of books and speakers and conferences and sermons solely focused on this topic. That's what it was built around. It became like our faith was entirely built on this concept of purity.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm Gen X, more raised in the 80s, college in the 90s. So it's really interesting to hear you make that distinction because I definitely had some of that. I remember being at a Christian conference in 88 and we all had to stand up and take the pledge to wait until we were married. But I will say a lot of that stuff you're describing, the books that started to come out around it, the movements, the culture, I think the era was just a little bit still more local, right? So there might just be some slight differences, but definitely the seeds of it I caught early on. And we'll have conversations with my friends about, gosh, wouldn't it have been nice, if we'd had some conversations about a whole being sexuality, not just wait till you're married and then you're expected. And you use this word in the book to just flip the switch, right? That's one of the myths.
Yeah, I would say my Gen X clients, they usually got these messages either later in high school or in college, maybe from a college ministry or around the time that I Kissed Dating Goodbye was released. I think that was like 93 or so. So if they're in college around that time, and it may have informed their choice to get married or who they married. But the reason why I say it affected millennials specifically is because abstinence-only sex ed was also a part of the public school curriculum when we were growing up. And so we got it not just in religious settings, but also in public school even. And also it happened during more of like those formative years, like middle school and early high school years for us. And so it really shaped our understanding of our bodies and of sexuality and even of relationships, maybe in a different way than I see with Gen X or even Gen Z coming up, because they got some of it too.
Yeah, it hasn't been fantastic for a long time, but it affects different generations differently. That makes sense to me. I have been searching for years for a skincare product that actually works to combat aging and wrinkles while restoring a youthful look to my skin. And over the years, I've tried dozens of different products and nothing has delivered the results I wanted or made me feel like I could trust the quality. But that all changed when I discovered Purity Woods. Purity Woods' mission is to provide us with the cleanest and most effective healthy aging products on the market. Their age-defying Dream Cream is a total game changer. It's USDA certified organic, non-GMO, and free of anything artificial. There's no toxic preservatives, synthetic additives, pesticides, or parabens. And best of all, it's cruelty-free. That means it's never tested on animals. The star ingredient in their formula is maple leaf extract. It's packed with antioxidants and anti-inflammatory properties that help soothe, plump, and brighten your skin. I love how it feels on my skin. It provides incredible moisture without causing any unwanted breakouts. Turn back time on the appearance of your skin with Purity Woods' age-defying Dream Cream. Purity Woods is currently offering 17% off site-wide, but we have an additional 10% discount for our listeners for a total savings of 27%. Go to puritywoods.com/bestofyou or enter code bestofyou at checkout for an additional 10% off your first order. That's PURITYWOODS.com and enter code bestofyou for a total of 27% off your first order. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you ever felt like you were hiding behind a mask, not fully able to show up as your true self? Maybe it's at work, in social settings, or maybe even in your own family. October might be the season for masks and costumes, but for some of us, wearing a mask can feel like a daily habit. Therapy can help you take that mask off and start to accept all parts of yourself and show up more authentically with other people. It's not just for those facing major challenges. Therapy can help you learn positive coping skills, set healthy boundaries, and become the best version of yourself. If you've been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's completely online, it's convenient, flexible, and fits into your schedule. You just fill out a short questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. Be sure to tell them that your faith is important to you, and you can even switch therapists at no extra charge at any time. Take off the mask with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/bestofyou today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/bestofyou. One of the things that's transformed the way I shop for my family's groceries is Thrive Market. They're not just any grocery delivery service. They are committed to the highest quality standards. And knowing that everything I order has been ethically sourced and meets these strict quality guidelines gives me peace of mind, especially when it comes to what I feed my family. With Thrive Market, I don't have to spend hours searching for my readers in the grocery store aisle trying to scrutinize those tiny labels, because I know their trusted ingredients are always certified organic and they avoid over 1,000 harmful additives found in conventional stores. It's a relief, especially when you're trying to account for dietary needs. And plus, everything we've tried, from the almond butter to the gluten-free pasta and gluten-free pizza, has passed the toughest critics, which is my family. Thrive Market is also on a mission to make healthy living accessible for everyone. For every membership purchased, they sponsor one for a family in need. Want to shop at a grocery store that actually cares for your health? Go to thrivemarket.com/bestofyou for 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. That's THRIVE market.com/bestofyou. thrivemarket.com/bestofyou. Tell me a little bit about, in your practice, how do you see it affecting? How do you see the residual effects on particularly women, but on couples of folks who kind of miss? It's not only that they missed a whole gap in their human development, but also got some of these toxic messages around sex. And again, I want to be clear, we're not necessarily saying the toxic messages have to do with premarital abstinence. You talk about that in the book, but the way it was talked about. So how do you see the residual harm of some of those methods?
So as you said, I'm a licensed psychologist, so I have a private practice where I see women and couples in my therapy practice. And then I also do coaching online, specifically for purity culture recovery is what I call it. And so I do see couples all over the country and women for that. And the ways that I see it mainly manifesting is causing problems in one's faith, sexuality, and relationships. Kind of those big three key areas. It causes faith struggles for a lot of people, faith doubts, periods of disillusionment, or feeling distrusting or distant from God. It causes problems in sexuality, and we can get into the more specifics, but sexual pain, low sexual pleasure, low desire, just difficulty connecting with their spouse once they're married and flipping the switch. And then problems in relationship, and that can be with others, like in a marriage, because there was sometimes these very limited roles and stereotypes that purity culture used. And so that can limit the ways that husband and wife interact in marriage. And also your relationship to yourself, your own mental health, your body image, shame about your body and your sexuality. And so those are the three main areas I see it showing up.
Tell me a little bit about, why do you think that is? What are some of these messages that are subtle and that people might not even realize they've internalized, the shaming messages? When you're doing work with folks, what are you trying to get to the root of?
Trying to get to the root of what are your beliefs and where did those come from? And if you can identify, like, who was it that taught you this, or what book you read it in, where did it come from, that can help them start to disentangle it a little bit, to see that this wasn't biblical. There were parts of it that were biblical, but a lot of it came from humans who are fallible and had good intentions for the most part. These people that taught us purity culture had good intentions, but there was just a lot of unanticipated consequences that didn't show up until 10 or 20 years later that we couldn't have expected. So I'm trying to get to the root of that and see how your faith, your sexuality, and your relationships got so entangled with this, and how you can find a healthy path forward.
And this gets to some of those myths you talk about. What are some of those myths that people have internalized that really wreak havoc in a healthy sexual and spiritual identity?
Yeah, you mentioned the flip switch myth, so I can start with that one. This idea that as soon as you get married, you flip a switch and sex is going to be instantly pleasurable and easy, only if you waited. And so that really affects people's sexuality because they realize sex takes a lot more education than we were ever given. It takes communication, it takes teamwork, it takes a compromise. There's just a lot that goes into it. It is not an overnight success. It takes work like any other skill in marriage. And it also affects people's faith because they were given this false promise and told that God promised them this. So then when it doesn't happen, I see people have a lot of disappointment and that distrust in God. Like, why did I wait if this is what I'm getting? Where's my reward? And that's also very connected with the fairy tale myth, which is if you wait, then you'll have a fairy tale marriage, you'll find your spouse. And for many people who are single much longer than they wanted to be, or who are in very unhappy, unhealthy, or even abusive marriages and maybe go through a divorce, or who are widowed, like that promise does so much harm. And that's really the myth that affected me the most, as I share in the book. And it affected my faith the most because I thought, where's the reward I get for waiting? Why haven't I met my husband? Because I met him a little bit later than I expected to and was single for almost all my 20s, which was very different in kind of my cultural background and upbringing. And in my religious community, that was considered pretty unique to be single throughout my 20s. So that was the myth that affected me the most and affected my faith.
That's interesting. There's a promise of if you do this for God, God will do this for you. And then when that doesn't happen, it's devastating. It makes a lot of sense. It's interesting when you talk about the myths because you use this word, and I have a lot of feelings about this word. I think the word gets misunderstood, but I actually think it's the right word in this context. You use the word deconstructing some of these myths. And I think what I want to say to the listener that I think is really important to understand about this word, when we take it in context and we're not for a second bracket all the things you've heard about this word, right? Because it gets so misused and so misunderstood. But honestly, I will say, as much as I had to deconstruct some of the messages I got about sexuality from religious communities, I also had to deconstruct messages I got from Hollywood movies about sex and love, right? And that's why I like the use of that word in this context and how you use it in the book, because you're really saying exactly what that word is. Like, we have to look at these messages and deconstruct them. We have to pick them apart and go, what is really at the root of that? That doesn't make sense. This isn't a logical or theologically sound argument. So, for example, to your point, this idea that God rewards people, if you do X, Y will happen, isn't a biblical or theologically sound assumption.
Right. Yeah, I use the word deconstruct because we're taking it apart and then seeing what part is biblical and true and good and beautiful and from God and consistent with our faith and values. And then what part was wrongly interpreted or handed to us by people with maybe good intentions, but it's just not true. And so I talk about deconstruction on this spectrum of home repairs. Like, not everybody just demolishes their house with a wrecking ball. And that's kind of what we sometimes hear about deconstruction, that you're just taking this wrecking ball to your faith or to your belief system. But it can be a remodeling of seeing what parts of this house are still working and what parts aren't, what parts are no longer serving us well, or they need to be updated because they were good materials back in the 70s or 80s and they're not now. You can deconstruct and still hold on to some parts of it too. I think that's another misconception is, well, when you deconstruct, you throw it all away and you just completely start over from scratch. But that's not what it's looked like for me. It's looked like a careful and kind of methodical process of picking apart what's true and what's unbiblical and still leaving a foundation of truth in there.
I love that, Dr. Camden. And you really talk about that in the book. You actually say in the book, what's interesting is that some critics of purity culture may say that my own beliefs represent purity culture 2.0, since I still hold on to an ethic of premarital sexual abstinence. But the belief itself is not what makes something purity culture. And I love this argument that it's how we believe what we believe and why we believe what we believe and what is underneath what we believe and how you're talking about it with your spouse, with your kids, with your friends, that you're bringing a whole body, and you talk about it in the book, your whole being into it. And you're also not assuming that your own perspective is the perspective for all people at all time in all places either. There's a humility with which, and one of the things I really like about what you do in the book is you provide a framework. You talk about Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning and Fowler's phases of spiritual development, this idea that we are supposed to be, just as we develop emotionally, we develop more emotional maturity, just as we develop cognitively, we develop more cognitive maturity, we develop more critical thinking skills. We're also going to be developing in our moral reasoning. And we may arrive at the same conclusions, but the way we've reasoned through those hard issues looks very different. And it leads to more, again, humility, a more robust, whole body, empowered, you use the word. Talk to me a little bit about that. I thought that was a really helpful reframing.
Well, yeah, as we develop cognitively with the ability to have abstract thought, critical thought, instead of just concrete black and white thinking, that goes hand in hand with our spiritual and our moral development too, because we're thinking about things in more nuanced ways. We're thinking about the gray areas. We're thinking about complexity. And so as we progress through that, we think differently about these issues. So my goal for the book was really to help people think of how to think differently and some tools and some frameworks for doing that without telling them what to believe. I really wanted to give people the tools to try to figure that out for themselves, because we didn't get that in purity culture. We were just told what to believe, what to do, what not to do. It was handed to us, and that didn't allow us as teenagers or young adults to apply the critical thinking that's necessary in order to make these really complex moral decisions about sexuality. And like you said, to have a holistic and integrated sexuality, which I think is what the Bible supports.
That's so good. And the book is filled with tools. One of the things I really like about what you do in the book is you say very clearly, look, I'm going to give you a wide list of tools, list of resources. I don't necessarily even agree with all of these lists of resources, but I believe in reading widely. And I thought that was an example of what you're trying to teach. Like, listen, we don't have to be so threatened. We can listen to numerous perspectives and arrive at our own sexual ethic, at our own moral reasoning that's biblically informed. There was this phrase I used to love in graduate school. One of my professors would always say, there are a lot of issues out there about which reasonable people can reasonably disagree. And so you're not trying in the book to tell people, as you said, what to believe. You're trying to say, listen, here's a bunch of different ideas about this. It's complicated. It's hard. Let's engage it. Let's not be afraid of it. And that's going to lead to this more wholehearted, more holistic way. I am curious, toward this end, I know listeners are going to be thinking, okay, this is great. This is great for me. I'm already married. I figured it out. I realized, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work and it's hard, but I'm already living this ethic. So how do I talk about it with my kids?
Yeah, that was the last chapter of the book, because that's pivoting. Where do we go from here? And I will have some clients that will say, why do I even need to kind of rethink my sexual ethic? Because as you said, I'm married, I'm monogamous with my spouse. This doesn't really matter anymore, what I believe. But I argue that it really does, because doing the work to think through it yourself and to arrive at a place where you feel confident and you feel like it's congruent with your theology and your faith and your values is empowering. So that's the first reason to do it. And the second would be to teach your kids, because we have to know what our values are in order to communicate those to our kids, at the same time knowing that they're going to have autonomy to make their own decisions one day and arrive at their own conclusions to their own thought process, and kind of respecting their critical thinking and their journey in this. But at the same time, I want to teach my kids my beliefs and my values about sexuality. But I also want to equip them with some critical thinking skills for them to think through how to apply this in their own life and the unique challenges that they're going to face in our changing world and with media and all that kind of stuff.
So what are some examples of how you might engage those conversations with your kids, or how you might coach some of your clients through those conversations?
We kind of start with basic things because I really think this can start from birth. Like sex ed is not a one and done talk. And that's how it was for me. And many of us growing up may have had this big talk with our same sex parent or I was sent to read a book and then, come back if you have any questions. But it's really an ongoing conversation that starts when they're young, talking about their bodies in non-shaming ways, using correct names for body parts, modeling consent with empowering them to be able to say no if they don't want hugs and kisses and things like that. So it starts really young with those kind of concepts. And then as they get older, infusing conversations with your family's values, like making this part of your everyday conversation of when things come up, asking your kids questions like, something happens on TV, a show, and what do you think about that? And here's what we might think about this, or here's what we think the Bible says about this, and why do you think that is? And kind of, I think those open-ended questions can really help foster some of that critical thinking.
That's really good to actually use the media instead of just turning it off. We don't watch this. This is bad. Saying, okay, this is interesting. What do you think about this? Because in that conversation, you're also, quote unquote, deconstructing some of the cultural messages or the media messages about sexuality. And you're having those conversations with your kids and together normalizing and demystifying. We need to talk about this.
I think those natural opportunities that arise are the best time to talk about it. When a new baby is born in the family, that's a time to talk about how the baby gets out and maybe how it got in there. Like with my little kids, that's what I would talk about. And just like, how do you make decisions about when you know you're in love or when you feel safe with someone? What does that feel like? Those are some of the more nuanced questions I might have with older children and teenagers. Yeah, so looking for those opportunities every day, I think, rather than making it that one and done talk.
That's just super practical. And then what do you say to folks who are really struggling with the disappointment, whether spiritual disappointment or disappointment in marriage, who are finding themselves like, man, this is not what I thought it was going to be? How do you talk with folks through some of those challenges?
Yeah, some of the, I guess, heartbreaking clients I work with are those that waited until they were married to have sex and maybe even waited to kiss until their wedding day because they thought that was the holiest choice. And they courted instead of dated and they got married young. And then now they've been married 20 years and their sex life has never been enjoyable. And it causes a lot of disconnection between them because they can't seem to make it work. And they've got guilt and shame and then maybe some resentment too. And it's just heartbreaking because they'll say, we just did everything right. We followed all the rules. Why has it turned out this way? And I really make space to validate those feelings of disappointment and not spiritually bypass them, saying something like, well, everything works out for the good, or just trust God. But no, just like really allowing you to grieve that together too. When I work with couples, I'm really big on this is not a me or you problem. This is an us problem. And this is something that it is outside of ourselves. It's a third thing outside of the two of us that we can unite together to fight against. And we can recognize that I didn't cause these problems. You didn't cause these problems. These are problems outside of ourselves that we had very little control or choice over. And we can have empathy for ourselves and each other because of that.
I love that really non-shaming. Let's come together in this, which also then leads to greater intimacy, which is truly what leads to healthier sexuality, is that ability to connect with each other through the pain of that.
Yeah, I hope by not seeing each other as adversaries, but as we're on the same team together and we're grieving together on how this problem has affected us and the pain that it's caused us over all these years. I hope by doing that they can feel closer and connected to each other. And my definition of intimacy is anything that makes you feel close and connected to your spouse or your partner or another person, because often intimacy gets very narrowly defined as just sex or just physical. And so the emphasis gets so put on that, like we're not having sex enough, or we need to have more sex, or I have low sex drive. When really it's about this holistic, are you feeling emotionally connected? Are you socially connecting, having fun together and doing activities together? Are you spiritually connected through praying together or serving at your church together? And then are you intellectually connected, talking about, your thoughts and feelings about things and reading books together or whatever it looks like for that couple? There's so much more to intimacy than just sex. And often when we focus on those other areas, couples will just naturally feel closer. And sometimes that has an effect on their sexual desire and their connection.
What would you say to the listener who right now is really struggling with, especially a woman who just wants so much to be a good wife and has internalized a lot of messages and feels a lot of guilt and shame for that part of her marriage? What words of encouragement or wisdom would you have for her?
I believe shame is not from God. That God does not use shame as a tool to try to get us to change. And I really differentiate in the book between guilt and shame. And I know you've talked about that too. We all borrow from Brene Brown some with that too, of guilt is I've done something wrong and shame is I am wrong. And women have a lot of both, but especially that shame about their sexuality. Something about my sexuality is wrong or bad, or I'm just not measuring up as a wife. If we can separate those two and really eliminate the shame part and then just examine the guilt part, are you acting in alignment with your values and beliefs? And if so, then the guilt is also not justified. So that's one of the kind of tools I help people to deal with their shame through, and helping women to feel that they're allowed to say no to sex. They're allowed to not always feel like they have to give their husband sex, because again, it's not a give and take, it's a sharing. We're sharing this experience together. We're sharing intimacy in our bodies together. But that was a very prominent teaching in purity culture, and really broader than just Christian culture too. It's this idea that men need sex and women have to, be available and serve their husband's needs. But I want to empower couples to feel like they can say no in a gracious way, and that they can navigate that together without resentment and bitterness towards each other and without guilt and shame.
You talk about in the book the need for embodiment, and that in many ways the purity culture messages around sex were very disembodied. Talk a little bit about how we can regain that sense of embodiment as an avenue for healthier sexuality.
I think that's an area I'm still working on too. Hillary McBride has taught me a lot about embodiment, and I quote her in the book. And that's very much still in process for me, is getting my mind and body integrated and aligned and really paying attention to my body. But I offer some suggestions in the book of ways that people can embrace and enjoy sensuality and being connected to their body and their senses, even if they are single or choosing to be abstinent, that you can still affirm your sexuality and recognize your desires. That doesn't mean you have to act on them. We can experience pleasure and express gratitude to God for that pleasure, that He made our bodies with the capacity for all sorts of pleasure. I'm not just talking about sexual pleasure, but the pleasure of good tasting food or pleasant smells or sights in nature and things like that. So, really getting in touch with your five senses helps with that embodiment, and just checking in with your body. That's a practice I'm trying to work on, of just checking in with how does my body feel and what information is that giving me about my emotions or about my mental state or about my needs. Does this mean I need to eat? Does this mean I need to rest? So yeah, our body gives us such good information, and many times we've just been taught to ignore it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great thread that you pulled. And I agree. I think it's hard for most of us women. We just have struggled with that embodiment piece. There's definitely the purity culture messages that I got, as well as then kind of held in tension with, well, it's also supposed to look like a Hollywood movie. And I don't always feel like, a Hollywood movie. Sex is not always like a Hollywood movie. And so, again, it seems so important to just honor the bodies God gave us in a non-shaming way, finding humor. I love how you're describing the ability to kind of teach couples to look at this as something they're in together, right? As opposed to against each other. And I think playfulness can be so helpful with that. Just kind of finding the humor. I think sometimes outside of the American culture, you see more of that. Just some of the humor in these bodies that God gave us, and the play that leads to that intimacy you're describing, that isn't only just this sort of Hollywood glam, kind of passionate, that isn't always part of it. Sometimes it's just laughing together. It's just enjoying each other and even laughing at the absurdity of it all at times.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't have to look like a movie set all the time. And because this is real life and real bodies and, kids and jobs and house and lots of life that we deal with, physical health. But I had a client the other day tell me when she went through premarital counseling, the pastor told her she was supposed to be a tigress in bed. And so that planted this seed of like, I'm not good enough. That planted the shame of, well, I'm not a tigress. Like, I don't feel that uninhibited and that constant sexual desire, whatever tigress means. And so she felt a lot of shame about that. And it was like, your husband married you for you. And if he is a good and healthy and loving and godly man, he accepts you for who you are and your body for how it is. And he loves you for that. And you can feel safe.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's such important work that you're doing, naming this. You're really naming it and you're really helping people reframe it and arrive at just a healthier, better place, which is how God wanted it. I'm always working to stay hydrated. My family teases me because I always have some form of hydration nearby or in my hand. And having safe, clean water is the last thing I want to worry about. And that's why you've got to check out AquaTrue. AquaTrue purifiers use a 4-stage reverse osmosis purification process, and their countertop purifiers work with no installation or plumbing. They remove 15 times more contaminants than ordinary pitcher filters and are specifically designed to combat chemicals like PFAS in our water supply. Best of all, the water tastes fantastic. It's portable, making it perfect for renters or college dorms. And the filters are affordable and long-lasting. I never worry about drinking tap water anymore. I know my tap water is not just filtered with AquaTrue, it's purified. AquaTrue comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee and even makes a great gift. Today, my listeners receive 20% off any AquaTrue purifier. Just go to aquatrue.com, that's AQUATRU.com, and enter code BESTOFYOU at checkout. That's 20% off any AquaTrue water purifier when you go to aquatrue.com and use promo code BESTOFYOU. If you're like so many of us, you carry a weight of buried pain. Despite looking put together on the outside, you might feel secretly fractured within, not knowing what to do with your suffering and fearing you'll be hurt again. Maybe you've learned to cope, to numb and suppress that ache inside, but it doesn't have to be this way. In his new book, Healing What's Within, therapist and professor Chuck DeGroat invites you on a compassionate journey inward to return to the life God created you to live. Chuck is such a wise voice and a trusted advisor, even in my own life. You'll discover how to confront what's keeping you stuck and understand the relationship between your body and your emotions. But most importantly, you'll learn how to experience real rest and renewal as you reconnect with God, others, and yourself. It's never too late to start healing. God's heart is always ready to help you find your way home. Healing What's Within by Chuck DeGroat is now available wherever books are sold. I'd love to circle back to the rest of these myths. What are some of these other myths that you keep encountering with folks?
Yeah, another one is the damaged goods myth. And that's the one that causes the most shame, because for people who do have premarital sex, for people who are sexually abused and didn't choose that, they're called damaged goods. They are told they have less to offer their future spouse. And that's so damaging and so not biblical. God doesn't look at us and see a damaged rose. He looks at us and see his beloved children, his beloved image bearers. He offers us forgiveness. He offers us restoration and wholeness. And so I think that myth is probably the most damaging. But the gatekeepers myth is really pitting women and men against each other and creating this sense where women are the gatekeepers of sexuality, that they have to be the ones to set boundaries before marriage and kind of constantly monitor how far are we going. But then after marriage, they always have to be sexually available and meet their husband's needs. That's the one I see causing the most problems in a marriage, in the relationship, but also sexually, because it's hard for women to kind of turn that off and to really be in their bodies, to be embodied and to enjoy the sexual experience with their spouse. So, and then the last one, the spiritual barometer myth, where we are better Christians and our spirituality is measured by our virginity prior to marriage. That affects my clients in that sometimes they get married and they think, am I no longer pure because now I've had sex? Like, does this mean I'm dirty? And it still feels wrong and dirty. Or I feel like I've lost this part of my identity even. Virginity became so much a part of your identity, your purpose, your worth. And I also don't think that's biblical, because our purpose and worth and identity is found in Christ and what he's done for us and our relationship with him and following and serving him. It's not just about this narrow definition of purity as virginity. It's about serving God with our minds, heart, bodies, and souls.
I love that you're naming that. Those are really helpful namings for people listening who are suffering with residual shame. And I'm curious, as we close, Dr. Camden, you talked a little bit about your own journey through your 20s, carrying some of these messages. What would you say to that younger single you now? With all that you know now, what would you want her to know? And what would you say to her?
Yeah, I have a different vantage point now because I am married and I have 2 children, and I feel very blessed, but I no longer see it as an if then. Because I followed the rules, then I am blessed. I see these blessings as God's grace to me, this unmerited gift. And I wrote my dissertation on grace and couples. And so that really made an impact on my faith and being able to reconceptualize that these are all gifts of God that I didn't earn, that I didn't perform to get. And so I think I would go back and tell myself, this is God's grace. Whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you have children or not, whether life hasn't turned out the way you expected, or whether you feel like you're living your best life, this is God's grace to you, and really trusting Him in that.
Yeah, there's no hierarchy of grace. Whether you're single, whether you're divorced, whether you're married, whether you're struggling, God's grace is right there for you. He loves you. I know what you're saying. So many of us, there was this hierarchy of, and still is to a large degree, and it flies in the face of the gospel. I love that you would be able to give her that message now, that she's not trying to earn something from God.
And with that, I want to be sensitive to, if you're in a state where you've been through abuse or a really traumatic divorce or something where you think, how is this God's grace? I don't mean to say that God caused that or that God will work it for good, any of those kinds of things. I mean it to say that even so, God's grace is with you. Even so, God's grace is available to you, and that He loves and sees you, and He's with you in your pain too. I really believe that He sees our pain. He's with us in it.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's a subtle distinction. I think about my own single years where there was just so much turmoil, because I was also married into my 30s, and even shame, around that. And I know what you're saying. It's not to say that this is God's grace, it's to say whatever your circumstances, God is there with you. And there is a subtle shift there. Even if the circumstances are really hard and I don't want this set of circumstances, it's not, oh, I've done something wrong to be in this situation, or I can do this thing to earn something different. Sometimes we just find ourselves in hard situations, whether married, single, sexually active, not sexually active. Sometimes things are just hard.
And that doesn't mean God's punishing you too. There was this sense that, well, this must be God's punishment that we're struggling in our sex life because we did have premarital sex or something like that. And I don't believe we serve a God that arbitrarily punishes us and causes that suffering to happen. But I think the world is hard. Life can be really hard, and hard things happen. Suffering is there, but He's with us even in the midst of it.
That's right. And sex is complicated and hard to figure out. And that has nothing to do with God's punishment. I love that you've written the book. It's such a helpful, again, I just want to say it's a really helpful resource to try to think about. I think there's a lot of people who've been hurt by this, but don't know how to rethink about their sexual ethic and what they really believe and what they want to claim and what they want to reclaim. And you're really giving people tools to do that for themselves, and also to do that as they parent kids and move into healthy relationships. It's such a great resource. Tell people where they can find you, where they can find your work, the book, all the things.
Okay, yeah. Well, my book is Recovering from Purity Culture. It's available on October 15th. You can find it wherever books are sold. And my name is Camden Morganti. You can find me on my website, drcamden.com, and on all the social medias at Dr. Camden.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Super grateful for your work, and thanks for giving us your time today.
And I'm thankful for your work too, Dr. Allison, because even though you don't use the word deconstruction, you've really helped us to see that some of these teachings need to be deconstructed, like turn the other cheek. You've taught me about that one. And so many that you've helped us see, like, what does God really mean by that? And how can we have a healthy spirituality and healthy emotional life?
Thank you. I've appreciated your encouragement along the way.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Pick up a copy of Recovering from Purity Culture anywhere books are sold. And thank you again. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Best of You. It would mean so much if you take a moment to subscribe. You can go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts and click the plus or follow button. That will ensure you don't miss an episode, and it helps get the word out to others. While you're there, I'd love it if you leave your 5-star review. I look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday. And remember, as you become the best of who you are, you honor God, you heal others, and you stay true to your God-given self.